While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. There is perhaps no greater confluence of old and new school ideologies than the current ransomware threat landscape plaguing the industrial sector. On one hand, the motivations and avenues of attack have changed very little. Hackers are still leveraging weak login security or lagging parameter defenses to steal data and launch malware as they extort the enterprise. However, that malware is now being released by highly specialized hacking groups that can launch and scale their attacks more quickly with AI tools. And with malware either sourced from another specialized provider or optimized, again, by AI tools. The overall result has been another surge in ransomware attacks against the hacking community's favorite target, manufacturing. Here to offer some insight on these and other trends related to ransomware in the industrial sector is Sean Nikkel. He serves as the team lead for Bitdefender's Cyber Intelligence Fusion Cell. Sean, thanks for taking the time, man. Good to see you, and appreciate you coming on Security Breach.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to talk about it. Like I said before, it's a hot topic. Lots of customers asking about it, and then just been touching our team pretty frequently in a lot of ways. So yeah, really looking forward to hopefully sharing some knowledge on this.
Absolutely. Well, that topic, of course, is a lot of the research that you guys have done on ransomware lately and some of the big groups, some of the more prolific activity that's been happening out there. I know a lot of times when we talk to experts in the field and we talk about some of these threats, it's kind of that same mantra of, well, the more things change, the more they stay the same a little bit. Yep. Maybe the tactics haven't evolved that much, but a lot of times it's the size and the scope of the attacks that are really evolving and becoming something new to deal with. Maybe you can walk us through a little bit on some of the things that you're learning with some of these new threat actors that are out there.
I would say that there's, the ones that have stayed consistently probably in the top 5, top 10 of ransomware groups. A lot of them are fairly prolific and have been established for a long time. So that kind of like leads to the belief that they're probably dealing with a large number of affiliates. So they're able to perform, large numbers of attacks at scale, and be able to do this kind of repeatedly and effectively. The things that are kind of interesting is with that many affiliates, you have a lot of different kind of playbooks and maybe preferences on types of attacks that get performed. So even though it's under one banner, 10 affiliates have 10 different ways to attack and kind of where they see to go. So it's, a lot of these kind of top actors, I think, are starting to specialize more in types of exploits and kind of targets of opportunity. And I know that, we like to kind of try to throw things in buckets and like, oh, they're going after healthcare or they're going after a lot of it is, I think there's a lot of target of opportunity that's happening where you have something that's vulnerable, that's exposed, and that's what's getting attacked at numbers. And then they're sort of figuring out from there, what's going to be the best payoff, who's going to be the most likely to pay, who's going to be the most affected by any kind of downtime or bad press. So, those additional pressure tactics that they use, who's going to be most affected by it. So I think there's a target selection once they've identified the vulnerability to get in.
Sure. So what are some of the names in the industrial sector we should be aware of? I mean, there seems like they're changing all the time, and that's sort of one of the dynamics with these groups. They're sort of dissolving and reforming. Who are some of the big players right now specific to manufacturing and industrial maybe we should be aware of?
Actually one that's just kind of off the top of my head that's very fresh is Akira. They've been a long time player in the ransomware space. We've seen a large number of attacks that seem to focus on industrial organizations, but there's a lot of organizations that kind of maybe overlap in other industries. they may have industrial applications and manufacturing, but they also do like IT and like specific software applications for those types of verticals. We're seeing, there's even maybe more specialized type industries that are like, like a professional services or consultant group, but their specialties are more in the manufacturing space or IT and technology and things. So seeing those types of industries getting hit that are going to have the most impact. For manufacturing, as we know, downtime is dollars. And so, looking for those companies. So I would expect, it's a lot of times most of the top 10 that are going to be specializing, at least a few of them that have affected organizations in the industry and manufacturing space.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put a link to this report too in the description of the episode, just to give folks some access to that and see some of the things that you've unearthed. You mentioned one of the bigger topics here in terms of payments. In the past, it was always, do you pay or don't you pay? I think there's been sort of an evolution or an understanding that sometimes there may not be an option there. What are some of the, I guess, trends that you're seeing or some of the factors that are coming into play when manufacturers of the industrial sector are looking to either pay or not pay that ransom?
That's a really interesting one to get into because, a lot of the groups that are out there that are publishing things on a disclosure blog or, other types of media where they're sort of like teasing, like, hey, this company's been hit. What's interesting is trying to see if there's an actual delta of like, the list appeared, it had 50 orgs on one day, and then the next day is 49. That would indicate that somebody probably paid or came up with some kind of arrangement. But it's, I think the one that's kind of more interesting that I've been seeing is, and as sad as it is, it's the organizations that are staying up on blogs, which means that they aren't paying, because to me that's almost more of a positive trend. If we're seeing 50 attacks performed and 50 organizations have not been removed from the blog, that means that those 50 orgs have not paid, and so they're going back to the affiliates and be like, all right, we got to find some new targets, and so while that's terrible for kind of everybody that's on the blue team, it is heartening to see that there are potentially organizations that are not cooperating and not sending payments. And I think the ones that are being public about it are probably few and far between. Like, you're not going to see the Instructures or the Change Healthcares or other types of orgs that in the past have been hit and have admitted to paying ransoms. I think if it's being done, it's still going to be quiet. But if it hits that maybe fever pitch of media coverage, like if it's somebody big, like it's a GM that gets hit, they're going to want to maybe reassure the public and probably say, hey, look, we paid to get the data back. We're more concerned about losing that. But I also think that's going to be kind of a rare occurrence. But it is something interesting that I think I would like to see more tracking of, just being in the field.
Absolutely. Well, one of the reports or some of the reporting that we're seeing is that there is a decrease in the number of ransomware attacks resulting in a payment. I'm a little skeptical there. I'm not sure how much I follow that. But if we can look at that as some of the positive news that it does represent, what do you think are some of the reasons that maybe folks are getting better at not having to pay the ransom as frequently as maybe they have in the past? Have there been some steps or some strategies that have been implemented to help them combat that situation?
I think, there's a lot of regulatory stuff that's starting to come around. We're starting to see more countries and regions that are like, kind of adopting like kind of stricter frameworks around payment. It ultimately, I think there are governments that are sort of like letting the businesses be. And it's sort of like caveat emptor, just, buyer beware, man. It's, they may or may not follow through, and it's kind of on you if you pay it. But I've definitely, seen and heard of more regulations that are sort of trying to keep people from essentially supporting criminal activity. So I'm curious to see how much more, like, if this turns into something like maybe there's regulatory fines where if you paid, maybe you also get hit by the government, or there's more stringent auditing, maybe more compliance steps you have to go through as a result. But I'm curious to see how these kind of reactionary laws and regulations, how they sort of become adopted and how they are enforced.
How do you think that's perceived? I mean, so much of a ransomware attack is a reputational dynamic or really a hit for the company. If they're straightforward and honest about saying, yeah, we did pay the ransom, forget the law enforcement, forget the regulatory, just within their peers and within the their environment that they operate, how do you think that's perceived? Is that perceived as weakness? Is that seen as them just trying to get back online? What do you think is sort of the attitude there towards those things?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's probably going to depend on the sort of maybe just public statements and things that happen, around it. So if it's like, in my mind and just my opinion only, it's, if they're kind of framing it as like, hey, we're doing this because we want to keep our customer data safeguarded. We want to make sure that, you continue to trust us. It's like a kind of an altruistic statement versus like, something more cold of like, we just needed to resume production, or I think it's going to be all in the messaging that kind of maybe helps with that public sentiment, or even just among peers. But it'll definitely be something to consider. Like, we saw with the breach of Canvas educational software earlier this month. I'm wondering if other educational software companies, if in the same space and the same types of products, if they see that payment happening, is that going to add more pressure to their risk decision of like, do we pay or don't? And I want to, I think only time will tell how that's going to turn out.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors, a lot of variables there. You get the insurance companies involved then as well, and even some of the SEC reporting for privately traded or publicly traded companies. It can get kind of messy in terms of those decisions for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to get into too is how these folks are getting in. And we hear a lot of different options. Just kind of want to run through these a little bit and get your feedback in terms of why it's such a problem, maybe some things that you've seen in terms of solutions as well. One of the big ones, and this goes all the way back to like Colonial Pipeline, but it's credentials. We're still seeing a lot of folks 100%. not strengthening their logins and things of that nature. How are we doing there? Are we getting better? Is that still continuing to be an issue? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, credentials still remain and probably one of the top three vectors of an attack. And it comes down to there's bad password management. So it's using default passwords, things that are easy to guess, things that are easy to break, maybe not implementing multi-factor authentication, whatever that is. I don't want to get into those arguments, but some sort of MFA, because I know people have very strong feelings about this, but it's kind of those kind of basic steps that help out. It's, I did a survey years ago about, password reuse, and the figures were pretty staggering as far as like, it's like over half of the passwords at use are probably reused somewhere else. So, my Twitter password could also be my same password to get into my Microsoft Outlook web application. So, it's one of those things that I think if, probably investing in some sort of threat intelligence monitoring can help. Have I Been Pwned has a lot of different types of API access that companies could use basically to tie into your Active Directory, and you'll be able to check, has this password been breached before? Should you change it? And forcing those resets when you know that something's been breached. But yeah, it continues to be a problem. I mean, I know we've seen just in the last few months, like we had, customer incidents where the password was definitely up for sale on an InfoStealer marketplace and was likely the entry vector. Or we've seen times where the brute force or just guessing the password worked and they got in. So yeah, that's going to continue to be the weak link for sure, until we kind of figure out better ways around it.
Well, it just goes back to, we've had a lot of people say it, I'm sure you feel the same way. I mean, the hacker would rather log in than break in. That's certainly
100%.
a lot easier. Kind of feeding off of that a little bit too, and something that people struggle with, and it shouldn't be as tough as it is, but the whole zero trust strategy. Mm-hmm. Where do you stand on that? I know some folks they struggle with it because it's an extra step, it takes more time, all of those types of things. Where are you at with zero trust?
I think as a concept, it's great. I think that, if more companies could get their arms around how to implement it and do it well, there's a lot of different ways to do it through, device fingerprinting, different ways around biometrics and all kinds of interesting ideas that people are coming up with. And I would like to see something where we get to a good standard where people can start implementing stronger things like this. Because the problem that I see is it's not a zero trust, it's a too much trust policy where everybody's an admin. And, if, Debbie from HR or, somebody has full admin rights, and if that password gets breached or that account gets breached, it's all over after that. So I think re-examining those types of user policies if you're not going to do zero trust, and trying to make things a little bit tougher for attackers, because you want to make it painful for them. And if you can create more friction around that stuff, however you do it, I think is the best way.
Absolutely. These next two kind of go hand in hand. When we talk about asset visibility and then endpoint security, it's just those are two struggles for manufacturing, especially as we continue to expand all the technology on the plant floor. What has been kind of your experience in trying to harden some of those endpoints, or at least identify where they are so we can strengthen them from a security perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to kind of tackle that. I worked at a larger hosting company before, and one of the things that we always ran into was like mergers and acquisitions. Where you assume somebody's technical debt when you purchase their stuff, and sometimes that you run into that shadow IT where you have this server that's been sitting out there for decades and everyone forgot about it. And so it's one of those things where we're trying to get that asset discovery, have some sort of database in place, whatever you can do to basically deploy visibility throughout the environment, however you decide to solve that, I think is good. Regular audits, and then anything like sort of just internal vulnerability scanning, all that different stuff can help discover assets, and then find out like what kind of risk it is sitting there. Do you have a critical CVE from 2015 still in the environment that's widely exploited? Then probably patch that. So and that's one of the things that not only discovering the assets, having them codified in a database somewhere, but also patching them. That's something that everybody struggles with. And I know we scream from our ivory towers about patch, but in reality, it's tough. So how do we get better about it, I think is going to be the big things. And it may even come down to having the software bill of material where you understand, within an application, all the different software dependencies that are there. It's a lot to tackle if you're sitting in an enterprise with 200,000 devices. So figuring out how to tackle it, that's the biggest problem I think where everyone stumbles.
Well, it's interesting because in manufacturing, we're very familiar with these continuous improvement models and strategies, always wanting to get better, always seeing that incremental improvement. Yeah. That doesn't always relate to our security practices. You're just talking about patching, huge challenge. I mean, shut stuff 100%. Down, apply patches, and there's always more and more coming out. I guess maybe from a cultural perspective, Sean, what are some of the things that you've seen that have helped some organizations just embrace cybersecurity more holistically and in a better way so that they can address these things as they need to, as opposed to either trying to, drink the ocean, if you will, with all the different challenges that can arise?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've discovered that kind of helps is that, at the end of the day, security is like a people business. There is a lot of technology, but there's always hands on keyboards somewhere. So it's like kind of like reaching across the aisle and trying to get rid of the silos and not having security just be the doom and gloom, like having it always kind of incorporated into the processes. And it's like, why don't I only hear from you when it's bad? It's like, no, like talk to people at the good times too. And, try to get out there and become part of operations and, have people know who you are in security in other areas. We had at the hosting company I worked at before, we had an incident management team that anytime there was a major thing that popped off, it was representatives from, any of the areas that were going to be affected were on the call. And so we were able to kind of bridge things, remotely, virtually within the same room. And after a while, after these different cycles, people got to know each other and they're like, oh, cool, Bob's here. Great. I know what I can get to, and, great. Mary's here. I can send this to her because I know that this is the stuff she handles, and so it's good when you can have those exercises. And I think that comes from maybe even just tabletop exercises, different stuff where when it's not the worst time in the world, it's like you get a chance to actually sit down with people and understand, like, this is what I do. Oh, cool. This is what you do. Here's how I can help you, or you can help me. And I think that's the kind of culture that I think helps enable security and in a lot of different ways, is just kind of establishing that network.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point you bring up about this. It can be kind of a doom and gloom business, if you will, but
100%, yeah.
to celebrate some of those wins is important too. I mean,
Yes.
and especially on the security side. I mean, it's kind of like baseball, right?
Yeah.
Somebody gets hit 1 out of 3 times, and they're one of the best in the game. Well, we don't think about the fact that they failed those 2 other times, or
Yeah.
all of those times that they were very close, or whatever the case is. So again, celebrating the wins, I think, could be a big part in sort of transforming some of those cultural issues
Mhm.
we have in the industrial organizations. So
Yeah. And
great
I think
point.
even, it could be even just the culture of it's not fault finding, it's kind of it's process finding, it's
Yeah,
improvement finding. It's like I'm not here to assign blame. I know things went terribly, but let's figure out how to not do this again. And having
yeah,
that mindset to sort of let's work out the problem instead of let's find who to blame for the problem.
yeah. Absolutely. Well, keeping it positive, Sean, let's talk a little bit about Bitdefender. Maybe you can tell
Yeah,
us a
let's
little
go.
bit about some of the things that you guys are up to and what you bring to the industrial sector.
Yeah, so Bitdefender's been around for decades at this point. We've been playing in the antivirus space for a very long time. Very early adoptions with technology. Kind of into machine learning and artificial intelligence, and kind of in the very beginning. And so, as the business has grown, we've just kind of grown to support beyond just your consumer or antivirus user. Where I just got my laptop and I need an antivirus now. So I download Bitdefender. It's turned into full enterprises that are using us. And so where I sit, I'm in the managed detection and response business. And so we are customer facing, where enterprises are coming to us that basically are just looking for that assistance with, more capability around a SOC, or having analysts, or even intelligence analysts, which is where my team sits. So a lot of times we're augmenting a security team, or there's a very mature SOC operation that we're just adding that extra firepower next to their expertise. So one of the things that I love about Bitdefender is the kind of community mindedness about them. We've done a lot of things to release ransomware decryptors and help organizations kind of in their time of need, and that was one of the things that attracted me to the job was. It's a tough time. I worked in insurance for many years, and when you can be there kind of in that tough moment, it's satisfying to be able to be like, I helped get you out of this, and we got through this together. We survived this terrible thing, and hopefully you never need us is kind of the other big part of it. But yeah, it's been a great ride at Bitdefender. I work with a lot of smart people, and we're all trying to do the good stuff, and try to how can we make things better? And I love that mindset.
Absolutely. I wanted to circle back a little bit to some of the research that you guys did on ransomware. Was there
Mhm.
anything within those findings, Sean, that really surprised you, made you take a step back that maybe you weren't anticipating, or you didn't anticipate seeing at that level that the findings showed?
Yeah, so one of the big ones that I participated in a little bit, and then also got a chance to sort of look into our own like enclave of MDR data, but the kind of rising trend around living off the land, and as I call it now, living off the shelf. It's one of those things where kind of in practice, it's like, man, we're getting through a lot of customer incidents, and we've been noticing like a lot less malware being used, and so it was kind of one of those things that looking at the big research we did, it was like, about 750,000 endpoints that they were able to do telemetry on, and actually see that like, over 80% of the attacks were using living off the land techniques. And so, it got me thinking, okay, how much of that were we seeing in our little enclave? Because we get to see the incidents cradle to grave, and so being able to see from that initial thing to the time we shut them down and kicked them out, we have all that telemetry. And so looking into our incidents, it was about the same amount of same figures, really. It was about 85% of attacks were using living off the land techniques. And in ransomware attacks, the first time we saw any sort of ransomware indication was ransomware notes were in the process of getting dropped, or they tried to execute the malware. And so up until then, it was a lot of system utilities. It was a lot of off-the-shelf freeware, open source type stuff that a lot of these guys were using in their playbooks. And so going back through these incidents, it was incredible like some of the ways that they were using living off the land stuff. So all your standard system Windows utilities, a lot of them had proficiency with Linux. So we saw these things happening in Linux environments also. But yeah, they're basically saving the good stuff, like the actual malware until almost literally the very end of the attack. So up until then, you're dealing with hunting down like what looks like admin activity, and so that's very concerning for blue teams because I'm in a 50,000 server environment. There's going to be a lot of noise there, and there's a good chance some of those attackers are blending in like really well.
That stat is incredible. 85% of all attacks had a dwelling or living off the land element to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, if there's anything that can wake people up in terms of investment in cybersecurity and some of the other things we've been talking about here, that stat alone should do it. That's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty incredible to even see. There was I know one attack that I was actually just looking at the other day, and it was remote management tools are a big thing that we've seen in criminal activity, and then even with ransomware actors. So it's using like TeamViewer or Splashtop, Screen Connect, like those types of programs. And it was the attacker. We saw them using Chrome Desktop, so we shut that down, and then they're like, okay, well, we'll use TeamViewer. So they started using TeamViewer. We saw that, asked the customer, are you using TeamViewer? They're like, nope. So shut that down. They pivoted to Screen Connect. And so they went through 3 or 4 different RMMs in one incident because we kept shutting them down. So they're adapting to those attacks. And so it's wild when you see that happen because you're just like, okay, these guys are definitely on the keyboard. Like this isn't automated. Like it's somebody that was like, uh-oh, I'm shut down. I'm using another one, go to plan C or go to plan D, so it's pretty amazing how everyone kind of always talks about the lone guy in the basement, but these guys are also technically proficient and they know what they're doing. So
well, we talked about the evolution of these groups. They're becoming more professional. You alluded to it, more specialized, all of those things as well. Another tool that we know that they're using is artificial intelligence. That's what's helping them move so fast. But it seems like, especially in these instances where we're talking about these living off the land attacks, AI could help the good guys quite a bit too. 100%. What is your take right now in terms of how the bad guys are using it and how the good guys maybe should be using artificial intelligence a little bit more?
Yeah, so we definitely have seen indications that they're using it either to code stuff with kind of mixed success. We've also, I know of at least one ransomware group that so when they exfiltrate their data and they get ready to post it on the site, they were basically kind of using AI to summarize the data that they got, and you could tell that it was definitely coming from an LLM. Like you'd see the M dash and kind of the language it was using. It was like clearly they're using an AI to like analyze all the data. But if I have 30 gigabytes of data, I need to analyze it quickly to post on a blog. What better way to do it? So they're definitely using it for different stuff. I theorize that they're probably in kind of the same place a lot of us are with AI and like trying to figure out like, where do I use it and how can I use it? And, what's going to be the best application? So I think, coding is going to be a big one. There's probably going to be some other elements there where, it could be something like a chat bot or something that's like, hey, I just hit this wall, what could be my next step, for the less skilled, lower tier, newer operators, that might be a way they go. For blue teams, I know that a lot of times, at least in my experience, we're kind of seeing it used as more like a force multiplier. So, I'm an analyst, I'm investigating the detection. It might give me some courses of action or like, hey, when you've seen this activity before, this was these are the 3 options for what you might want to look at next. Or, so it's giving me options as I'm investigating and kind of being in sort of interactive, like a conscience maybe, or a tiny Yoda that's helping you out and guiding you along. My team, we use it a lot for research and kind of uncovering interesting data points we hadn't considered and kind of seeing gap analysis. So there's a lot of ways that I think we're all leveraging AI, and again, I think time will tell what becomes more successful. But we've come leaps and bounds in just a couple of years. We've gone from 9-fingered people to very convincing real fakes, and within 2 years. So yeah, I'm curious to see how this continues to develop. But I know for us, Blue Team is human in the loop, aided by AI. So, and I don't think we're getting replaced yet.
Yeah.
But
Well, and that's the point I was going to make. I'm all for the false multiplier. Let's get as many, Yodas
yeah,
out there as we can.
yeah,
But we also need some human bodies on there to make sure we're QAing stuff and
yeah.
guiding and using the tools the right way. And I think that's where we're still figuring out that right mix. I think I've
Hmm.
seen way too many situations where folks went overboard and they're too reliant on AI,
Yeah.
which can lead to its own collection of problems that we could spend another hour talking about. But
Oh, easily. Yeah. I mean, I know that at RSA, it was like, I can't remember how many booths were talking about like agentic AI SOC, and it's
yeah,
like, I don't know if I'm ready to give the keys to completely do a clanker yet, but,
I'm with
uh,
you. Yeah,
I think, if you have a smart analyst that's being enabled with, different types of research tools that can
yeah,
help get through a detection faster investigation, I'm all for it, and I
yeah.
think that's probably where we need to focus is how can we enable the humans on the keyboards to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can agree with you more. Wrapping things up, Sean, this has been awesome. Really appreciate the time, man. We've talked about AI and a lot of other stuff, but are there any other trends that you're kind of seeing could have an impact over the next stretch here?
I think that you can definitely kind of read about it in a couple of popular books right now. But I think it's going to be interesting to see what's going on with the exploit marketplace. And one of the things that we've been watching is sort of like that time to exploit and how fast you go from a proof of concept to a working exploit, and then not only working exploit but like scaled out to a lot of different users. So I think that's something that's going to be interesting to watch, especially with AI now being involved. Claude can do some great stuff, and a lot of other LLMs out there. So those it could be, because part of that is these a lot of these ransomware operators are kind of specializing in exploits. We saw this with Clop a couple of years back when there was a particular software that got exploited, and they were, I think the number got up to about 3,000 organizations in like 2 months. And that's insane numbers, and that's before AI was really a thing. And so I think that they're looking for like things that they can exploit quickly, and things that are being widespread, in widespread use. So, network edge devices are always going to be top of the list, and, different things that face the public. So I think keeping an eye on that stuff as the vulnerability numbers continue to grow, and as sometimes budgets are starting to shrink, is starting to realize like smart prioritization of vulnerabilities, because they're getting exploited faster and at scale a lot faster too.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see when you talk about those vulnerabilities, how the resources out there are
Mm-hmm.
impacted going forward. We got some stuff going on with CISA, some stuff going on with the MITRE database. We'll see
Yep.
how all this plays out, and that's going to be very important for organizations to stay on top of those CVEs, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, with some of these groups that are getting some income, a lot of them have the budgets to afford buying exploits off the market. And if they
Yeah.
don't, a lot of them are being run like a big business. So you have the software developer team within these operators that are working on exploits, and they're watched and used. Like I've seen dark web forum chatter about, like the latest, 0-day that got published by Microsoft or, somebody like that. So they're watching them use too, and they're keeping an eye on stuff, and they're working on their own things. And if they have their own exploit that they're not going to share, that's when it gets a little scary too. So it's, yeah, I think, hopefully we can bleed them dry by not paying them, but we'll see. It's cat and mouse for sure. The
Absolutely.
definition of it.
The evolution continues without a doubt. Sean,
Yeah.
thanks so much for the time, man. Really appreciate it. If anybody wants to learn a little bit more about what Sean and his teams are up to, you can check them out at bitdefender.com. I'd also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Sean Nikkel, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.